All right, everyone. So let's talk about American German tensions over Iran. Essentially, Germany wants to maintain its relation with Iran, and this is to the anger of the United States, which wants all of its allies to no longer have economic ties with Iran. This tension between the US and Germany over Iran has been going on for quite some time. You can go all the way back to the Clinton administration, and you will find that the United States government was trying to pressure the Germans to stop economic relations with the Iranians. This tension exists today. Trump pulled out of the Iran deal. The Germans said, we're not going to listen to the Americans. And that has been a cause of friction. So in late 2002, because we're going back a long time ago, '02, that was a long time ago. It definitely feels like a long time ago. But I want to show you guys that this tension between the US and Germany over Iran goes back a long ways. So in late 2002, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, wanted to inspect Iran's nuclear facilities and activities. They wanted to make sure that Iran was not enriching uranium. The Iranians refused to allow such an inspection, and eventually the IAEA was able to do an inspection, but it was months and months later. And in the early part of 2003, specifically in February of 2003, the IAEA confirmed that Iran had been enriching uranium. So the IAEA told the Iranians that they needed to be under a strict protocol. And if they refused to be under this protocol, that there would be sanctions imposed on Iran, which would greatly hurt the Iranian economy. And we know today that this is the case because the United States imposes sanctions on Iran, and the Iranian economy is an absolute terrible, dire condition. The Iranian currency free falls, and its economy is in a very, very detrimental and devastating state. So the IAEA basically said, listen, Iran, you have to be under a certain protocol, a certain system of procedures. We have to have unlimited access to your nuclear facilities and activities. We have to surveil and observe and superintend what you guys are doing to make sure that you guys are not enriching uranium. And you guys need to cease all activities in which uranium is enriched. The Iranians did not really want to acquiesce to these demands, and so the IAEA basically said, okay, we're going to go to the United Nations, the Security Council of the UN, and from there, sanctions will be implemented. The United States, of course, wanted this to happen. The US wanted Iran to have absolutely no nuclear materials, not even materials that would allow for just regular energy use, let alone weapons use. But the Europeans, they were more resistant to this, and the Europeans began to prevent the move towards imposing sanctions on the Iranians. The Germans were the biggest advocates for precluding this move, but the French and the British were also involved in preventing sanctions from being imposed. The Germans were probably not probably, they were the biggest advocates for it, but the British and the French also did not want to cut off Iran so quickly. And so the Germans and the British and the French, they got together. They sent some representatives to Tehran, and they told the Iranians, if you simply comply with the IAEA, we will make sure that you guys will be okay economically. Um, and you guys can have nuclear materials, but just don't enrich uranium. So the Iranians said, "Okay, fine, we agree," and the Europeans saw this as a success. So this is kind of like it's kind of like an early form of the Iran deal, uh, because what the IAEA stipulated in their demands was quite similar, very much so the same as what the Obama administration proposed in the Iran deal. The IAEA could have unlimited access to all of Iran's nuclear facilities, could watch and observe what Iran was up to, and failure to satisfy these demands would lead to sanctions. So the Europeans, they saw this as a success. They said, "This is great. We can continue doing economic work. We can continue doing commerce with the Iranians, and we'll be good." Washington was upset, but Washington sort of backed off and gave up on its push to impose sanctions on the Iranians. Um, but the Iranians ended up lying about agreeing to the demands of the IAEA. The Iranians basically said, "Oh, we found a loophole. We don't really have to listen to the IAEA. We don't have to do much of anything." Um, and I'll read to you guys this line from this book. I'm almost done with it. It's called Germany and Iran by Matthias Kunzel, a German political analyst. And it's a very educational book on the history of German-Iranian relations in light of German-American tensions. It's a very fascinating study. It's actually one of a kind. I've never found a book like this before. So it says here that they, the Iranians, had concealed the fact that they had advanced P2 centrifuges. They had kept quiet about their attempts to produce the polonium-210 isotope that is used for ignition purposes in nuclear weapons. The inspectors discovered that it was the Iranian army that had been building centrifuges for uranium enrichment at military bases. But there's one part here that I really want to emphasize on, and that is the German resistance towards American power, American control. Because at the end of the day, this is what it really comes down to. It's not just about Iran. It's not just about Iran's commercial dealings with European countries. It's not just about Iran's economy. This is ultimately about the rise of German power and the revolt of the German against American control. America controls most of the world. The only reason why America kind of has a problem with Russia is because Russia is a country that America can't really control. The same thing can be said about China. Although I would say that America has a lot more power over China, given the fact that Walmart could shut down China's economy. But if you look at Africa, South America, Central America, Europe, the Middle East, America has a tremendous amount of power over these parts of the world. America has control over the oceans. And I've said this many times, there's not a single empire in history that had the control over the seas like the United States does. The United States controls the oceans. Um, and so empires have never lasted forever. We all know this. If that were the case, then we would still be sending money to the great Mongolian Khan. We would still be sending a tribute to the Roman Empire. Empires don't last forever. They don't. And empires eventually crumble. They crumble for various different reasons, but quite a common pattern is that you have tons of corruption that goes on within an empire. You also have a tremendous amount of moral decay. You have degeneracy. You have sloth that becomes very prevalent, and people begin to want to depend on the government more. They begin to want to not really work. And so you have a decayed society, and the empire begins to crumble. Of course, you have other factors as well. An empire could stretch itself too thin. We saw, well, not we, but this is one of the things that hit the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire thought that it could expand tremendously. And so the Roman Empire went all the way up to Great Britain. And that was way too far for Rome. Rome is all the way down in southern Europe. It's a long journey, long trip, and it's difficult to control a place like Great Britain from a place like Rome, which is all the way in southern Italy, and it's difficult to uh, have to continuously send Roman troops to England to make sure that those people don't revolt. And so the Roman Empire stretches itself way too thinly, and it actually weakens it, as opposed to keeping the empire within close boundaries, keeping the empire within countries that border with each other. You try to expand way too far away, and it actually weakens the empire. Um, Empires try to expand too much, and this is also one of the downfalls of empire. Um, Hubris plays an excellent role in this, a very efficient role. People get too carried away with themselves. We're the best. We're number one. I mean, I understand that the Carthaginian Empire didn't last that long, but one of the downfalls of Hannibal was his hubris. He thought, well, I've crushed the Romans in Cannae. I could easily go to Rome and destroy the Romans there. And his brother said, invade Rome now, Hannibal. Invade Rome now. And Hannibal said, no, I'm going to wait. I'm going to take more territory. I think I have this problem completely covered. I will do very, very well. We have all the time in the world. We'll take more and more Italian territory. Eventually, we will hit Rome. And the brother says, no, hit Rome now. They're terrified of you. Just hit them now when they're psychologically down. The brother thought, Hannibal thought, that he was invincible. He thought that his success was inevitable, and that was his downfall. He gave the Romans enough time to recuperate, to recover their morale, to reboost the valor of the people, of the masses. Empires have only so much time to conquer and expand and impose power. Eventually, people are going to revolt. I shouldn't say one. I mean, who was the people that really crushed the western half of the Roman Empire? The Germans. I understand that the Roman Empire continued on in the east, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Middle East, and that was eventually crushed by the Turks. But as far as the Western Roman Empire goes, the western half of the empire, that was destroyed by the Germans. The Germans hated the Romans. The Germans didn't want to be under the control of Rome. Just like today, Germans don't want to be under the control of the American Empire. So basically, in the German point of view, it's not just about having economic ties with Iran. It's about having economic ties with Iran without the intervention of the United States. Because the Germans know that the Iranians don't like America. The Germans know that the Iranians hate Israel, hate NATO. And the Americans know that the Iranians, if they're unleashed, they're going to make nuclear weapons. I mean, they've already enriched enough plutonium or uranium. The Americans know this. And so the Americans are trying to weaken Iran by destroying its economy through sanctions and trying to prevent other countries from doing business with Iran. The Germans say, well, we want to continue business with the Iranians. The Americans say no, and the Germans say nein. You're not going to tell us what to do. So this is about revolt. This is why I'm so focused on this. It's not to talk about Iran. It's not to bash Iran, or it's not to say that, well, it is to bash Iran, because Iran has a pretty twisted culture, but it's not just about that. It's ultimately about the rise of German power. And I think that one of the catalysts towards the German revolt against the US is the controversy over Iran. So now that I've said all that, I want to read to you guys this part of the book here. So it talks about how after it was discovered that Iran was enriching uranium in the early 2000s and the Americans wanted to impose sanctions, the Germans intervened. And it says here, um, paradoxically, rather than causing a dispute between Iran and Germany, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT breach exasperated a German dispute with America over Iran, according to the German ambassador in Washington, Wolfgang Ischinger. And this is what Wolfgang, is it Iskinger or Isinger? Quote, we prevented the Iranian dossier from being referred to the Security Council, as agreed. So the IAEA was going to send a letter to the UN Security Council, basically saying Iran has breached the NPT, and so the Germans prevented this letter from being sent. It prevented the complaint being it prevented it from being sent out to the UN. So it says here, we prevented the Iranian dossier from being referred to the Security Council as agreed, boasted the German, actually, no, sorry, Isinger did not say this. The German ambassador in Tehran said this, Paul Freyer von Malzahn, in an interview with the Iranian daily Shargh. And he went on to say, quote, although, quote, the United States is exerting pressure on the 3 EU states, we have still stuck to our guns. This is what Mr. Malzahn said. He was the ambassador to Tehran. So the Germans were boasting about how they were able to stop sanctions from being imposed on the Iranians. And he said the United States is exerting pressure on the 3 EU states, Germany, France, Great Britain. We have still stuck to our guns. So it really goes to show you how the Germans, for years, for a long time, have been resisting American power over this issue. You can go all the way back to the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president, and you will find the Clinton administration saying, hey, those terrorist attacks that happened against American soldiers in Lebanon, they were backed by Iran, so I don't want anyone doing business with Iran, blah, 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 blah. Germans come out and say, nine. You go to the early 2000s, 2003. Hey, it turns out that Iran is enriching uranium that's not have any economic ties to them. Germans say nine. And now, in our own times, just recently, Trump, in 2018, which is pretty recent, Trump pulls out of the Iran deal. And whether or not that was a good decision is to be really debated. But Trump pulls out of the Iran deal, and the Germans say, well, we have to replace America. That's it. We really can't trust you people anymore because you don't really care about security. Now, there's another, and this ties into what I just said, there's another interesting point that's made by Kunzel in this book, and that is that the reason why, or one of the reasons as to why Germany wants Iran to go nuclear, because you can't sit there and say, no, well, Ted, the Germans, they simply want Iran to be allowed to have nuclear material so that they can have nuclear energy, so that they can, turn the light switches on. That's all this is about. Yeah, you can't really sit there and tell me that the Germans don't know what the Iranians are up to. In fact, the book demonstrates that the Germans did know. I mean, there was so much evidence from the IAEA about how the Iranians did, in fact, want to enrich uranium and do all that stuff. And the Germans were still saying, no, let them have their nuclear materials, blah, 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 blah. So the Germans, obviously, they know what Iran... It's so obvious. Like, I remember, we've all seen the videos of Ahmadinejad and all these Iranian officials talking about how they want to destroy Israel and have nukes and all these things. Like, it's obvious, right? But the Germans, they... one of the reasons, and this is an observation that's made in the book, one of the reasons as to why Germany wants to allow Iran to have nuclear materials and ultimately a nuclear weapon is because both Germany and Iran are in the have-nots of nuclear proliferation. So we have numerous countries, a handful of countries in the world that have nuclear bombs. At least it's been confirmed that they have nuclear bombs. America, France, these countries have nuclear bombs. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. I believe Great Britain. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But there are numerous countries in the world that have nuclear weapons. Germany does not have nuclear weapons, right? It doesn't. Now, because of the Cold War, America parked nuclear weapons in Europe, but those are still American property. I'm talking about German-made nuclear weapons. Germany doesn't have those. Iran doesn't have any nuclear weapons yet. But Germany wants to be amongst the haves, just like Iran wants to be amongst the haves. And so Germany sees like a kind of a common cause with Iran. Like America has nuclear weapons, and then America has all this control as to who has those weapons and who can't have those weapons. You and I, we both want nuclear weapons. We both really don't like the United States having all this power. Let's work together. And so Germany and Iran are both pursuing the same thing, and that is to be amongst the haves as far as nuclear attainment goes. And let's not forget, I mean, I know this is like a really obvious thing, but let's not forget what Germany did over 75 years ago to the Jewish people. We all know what the Germans did. I don't really have to get into it. And I really find it interesting that the country that was the closest to exterminating the people of Israel is also the country that's the most, at least in the Western world, that's the most ardent about supporting Iran, which is really the only country that has openly declared its desire to wipe all the Jews off the face of the earth. I just find that interesting. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.